As Johnny mentioned, tonight's presentation is following the same top 10 theme that had been started and had been presented for a number of other lodges. I chose, in this case, I collect all of New England, but I chose in this case to start with Kahagon Lodge 131, which was chartered to the Cambridge Council in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And for a couple of reasons. One, their rare stuff is super rare. And it's not well documented. Even the stuff that we documented for Blue Book is out of date. So I wanted to cover that. And I was a 40 plus year member of Kahagon Lodge 525, but I was registered with Kahagon Lodge for 2 years while I was in college. So it is kind of meaningful to me as well. So we'll get right into this. The New England OA top 10 for Kahagon Lodge 131. And so as a matter of introduction, I'm Roy Wetherbee. I was the Blue Book regional editor for Region 1 New England for the first 6 volumes of Blue Book. I'm currently a Catamount Lodge charter member. I was a Kahagon Lodge 525 member since my youth. I was also a past lodge advisor of Kahagon Lodge back in the mid-90s. And I'm currently advancement chairman for my son's troop, which is Troop 114 Shrewsbury. I've been collecting since 1977 when I attended my first jamboree, which was actually the Canadian Jamboree in 1977. And my collection since 1987 has been focused on New England OA. And that was attributed to the New England OA book that Rob Kutz published in 1987. So talking about top 10, I know some people have followed kind of a countdown format. And then, what do you mean by top 10? Top 10 what? And some people might choose to speak to the top 10 issues by dollar value, or the top 10 issues by scarcity, rarity, difficulty in finding, or obscurity. You could just choose the top 10 just because you like them, top 10 personal favorites. Or I could be, really self-centered and talk about the top 10 issues that I'm still looking for myself. But for this presentation, I've taken the rarest or most difficult to find approach. And this does generally tend to correlate to value as well. Some things are underrated, so they may not command the value that their rarity might suggest, but that's the nature of the hobby. So Kahagon Lodge 131, Cambridge Council, Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was first chartered in 1938, and it merged, or was actually absorbed, by Massachusetts Lodge 52 in the year 2000. And Lodge 52 was later merged into what is now Pennacook Lodge. Cambridge Council covered just a single community, and it had a population of around 100,000 when the lodge first chartered in 1938. The city's population peaked in 1950 at around 121,000, but it had dwindled to just 95,000 by 1980. And finally, it had rebounded to 101,000 by the time the lodge merged in 2000. But this is a pretty big city. And so it's very urban. And as people know, particularly in the 70s, 80s, scouting took a beating in urban areas of the country. And the same here was true of the council. And this council actually lost their scout exec in 1997. And because of the membership and financial situation in Cambridge, National wouldn't give them a new scout executive, but it did permit them to stay chartered for a couple of years with a district exec. And it was a district exec that actually reported over to Knox Trail Council in Framingham, Mass. For a few years. But ultimately, the lodge did merge in 2000. So you're going to see a theme here because quite simply, the very best issues from this lodge are generally their arrowhead-shaped neckerchief patches, which were restricted from the very beginning to one per life. They were first issued in 1954, so that would be the A1 in the upper left-hand corner. And they continued in various variations all the way through to the year they merged in 2000. They're most often found on a maroon neckerchief with a white border. And we see in the lodge's history that maroon and white were the lodge's official colors. And then the earliest neckerchiefs had white piping. These were issued in the 1950s. And then later they had a white inner ribbon border. And then you'll see here, I've got 7 different varieties of their arrowhead patches. And then I will round out the top 10 with a few other issues. And as an alternative to the countdown format, I'm just going to speak to these in their order of issue, particularly with the arrowheads. And I'm going to start with the A1. So these are the earlier arrowhead issues. And these, again, started with the A1 in 1954 and carried into the 1980s. I don't have exact dates of the issues. But I know that one issued in 1954 because that's documented in their lodge history. And I know from the neckerchiefs that the A2 also came out in the 1950s, likely the later 1950s. And then the A3, 60s, 70s, A3B, I think was certainly 70s, 80s, and then we'll talk about some of the later issues later. But here I've got pictures of these issues. I happen to have an A2 that has a perfect thread break where the 131 is missing. You hold it up to the light, you can see the pinholes where the needle broke through the twill. So it's definitely a thread break and not a needle break. But it's otherwise mint and perfect. So I hung on to it. And then all the ones on this page up to the A3B are gauze backed, and then the A3B is the first plastic backed arrowhead. And so from the 50th anniversary history of the lodge, which was also reprinted in 1998 for their 60th anniversary, we see that the lodge designed its first patch in 1954. According to Frank McGrath, and I'll just note that he was the lodge chief that year, he said, "First, we adopted the red arrowhead shape, which stood for the order of the arrow. Next, since our name Kahagon means in the forest, we decided to include our totem, the pine tree. This is the totem that we adopted when we first received our charter. The bolt of lightning passing through the pine tree comes from an old ceremonial team custom where they used to paint the pine tree with a lightning bolt through it on their chest. The lightning symbolizes the power from above that guides us on our scouting journey. To this, we added WWW, which gives the essential meaning of our order. Our name and number, Kahagon 131, completed the patch, which we hoped would exemplify the past, present, and the future of the lodge. And it really did, because these arrowheads carried through right to the year 2000. They mentioned the first tap out for adults was held at Camp Ted, with an emphasis on the adults' role in the Order of the Arrow. So that happened in 1954 is the first time they went and tapped out adults. And their first neckerchief was made using the colors of maroon and white. So getting right to it, this was the first patch issued by the lodge. It's an A1, A representing arrowhead shape. It has a gauze back. It's 71 by 81 millimeters when it's in mint condition. The base of the arrowhead is 32 millimeters wide, 44 millimeter tall tree, 46 millimeter name, 6 by 6 millimeter round O in the name, and a 3 by 5 millimeter thin rectangular tree trunk. And all those details are necessary. And later in the presentation, you'll see why. Because they did try to carry the same design through the entire history of the lodge. But this A1 is, in my opinion, the most difficult and the most valuable patch of the entire lodge. Extremely difficult to find. I haven't had a dupe before. I haven't seen another one myself. I did go back and I checked the old Arapaho 2 with pictures, and the A1 that they had pictured in that was indeed the A1. So the key to that identification is, if you look at the tree trunk here, it's a cylinder, it's a rectangle. It's very even and straight and thin. It's more narrow than the width of the A that's below it. Most people that I've spoken to that claim to have an A1, I found that their A1 was actually an A2. So these are the key identifiers for the A1. So now the A2. This came out also later 50s. It has a gauze back. It has these various dimensions. And I make a note here that these dimensions are taken from mint specimens, because I think a lot of the measurements that were taken in some earlier reference books may have been taken from used patches. And, of course, you wash a patch and it shrinks and your dimensions are just, not valid anymore. So this is bigger. Instead of roughly 71 by 81, it's 77 by 87. So it is a larger patch. And these various detailed measurements are all slightly different. But what's key is, instead of that rectangular or cylindrical tree trunk, you have a trunk that is now flared out towards the bottom, and it has this little blob of vertically embroidered threads at the top of the base, kind of between the tree trunk and the tree itself. And that's key. And you can spot that, even from a distance. And I've seen this, so I have this in my collection. I have 2 more on 2 different neckerchiefs. So out of all of the Kahagon arrowheads, I find that this is probably the most common variety. And I think the lodge was probably larger back in the 50s, 60s, and then started to get smaller 70s and 80s and 90s. But it still commands a pretty decent value because, again, it's so old and it does date back to the 50s. But again, a lot of people that think they have the A1 actually have this A2, and it's that flared tree trunk with this blob of vertical embroidery at the very top there. That's the key to identifying this issue. So then, of course, they run out and they reorder, and it comes in a little different, but millimeters different. They were consistently inconsistent, or inconsistently consistent, which is why all these measurements matter. A3A. So the next one, slightly different dimensions. What we see here, still a gauze back. We see that the flaring of the trunk is even more exaggerated than it was on the A2. But that blob of stuff at the top of the tree trunk isn't there anymore. So that would be their third arrowhead issue. And then A3B, which could be argued that it's A4. It's their 4th issue. It's an almost identical patch. There are, the colors are slightly different. The colors are slightly darker. The measurements are exactly the same. And then, of course, as you can see from the reflection in the middle image, it does have a shiny plastic backing. And I believe the flare on the tree trunk there is perhaps even 1 millimeter wider than it was on the A variety. but still very similar issues. So this plastic bag variety, I believe, came out in the 70s, carried through into the 80s. Of course, they were meant to be sewn on a neckerchief. The fact that I have a number of mint specimens that have never been sewn suggests to me that the patch and the neckerchief came separately, and that, you know, mom would have sewn the patches onto their neckerchiefs for their child. But the earlier 50s era neckerchiefs were maroon with a white piping. And later in the 60s, they switched to this maroon with a white inner ribbon. But these are both A2 arrowheads. And again, these were one per life. And then it seems they sourced things in small quantities. So I've seen, these are all mint neckerchiefs, but they're all slightly different shades of maroon. So I'm sure there are other varieties that are out there as well. And then we get to the later arrowhead issues that came out, I think, you know, mid to late 1980s and carried through to the year 2000. They're all computer designed, so they don't have that nice, rich, thick Swiss embroidery. It has like a really thin, kind of cheap looking computer designed embroidery. The close-ups will show this. We had an A4, which has kind of like a white paper or muslin backing. Then an A4.5, which I actually only found fairly recently. It was not listed in Blue Book because I acquired it since then. Had a very thick, clear plastic backing. And then the A5, which I know to be the last issue of the Lodge because that was current when the Lodge merged in 2000. It has a round top 3. All their other arrowheads have a flat top 3 and has this white kind of milky plastic back. So looking at them more closely, the A4, it has this kind of a white papery back. The dimensions, again, are all pretty similar to what we had seen for the others, you know, minor difference here and there. The flare or the flaring of the trunk just seems to get a little more pronounced with each of these issues. And then the A4.5, which I discovered more recently, has never been listed. Again, has a clear plastic back. The yellow here is almost an orange. So it's quite a bit darker than the earlier issues, which generally had yellow lettering and details. But again, the dimensions are all kind of in the ballpark. Again, the very flared, almost triangular tree trunk. And, you know, this just leads me to believe that there may be more varieties out there because this was a very small lodge. These were very restricted, so they don't turn up very often. And, you know, I have a number of them in my collection, both on and off the neckerchief, but I've never had a dupe. It seems that every time I acquire a 131 arrowhead, it's different from all the other ones that I have. So it's important to pay attention and look at the details. And then finally, the A5, which was the final issue, has this kind of white, milky plastic backing. It has the round top 3, which is the only arrowhead they ever issued with that. All of them had flat tops 3. It has this tiny little stubby tree trunk. And it was the final arrowhead issue of the Lodge. And so having gone through all those details, I pulled together just a quick summary chart here showing everything that's going out. So, you know, the first 3 out of 7 had just a plain gauze back. Where the A1 had these dimensions where the thin tree trunk is really the distinguishing factor. And then the A2 came out, it's a bit bigger. across the board in terms of all of the dimensions here. And then the 7x5 millimeter trunk is flared at the bottom, and it has that vertical stitch blob at the top. And that's the distinguishing factor for that issue. And then A3A and A3B are virtually identical. They're identical in size, in the baits width, the tree height, the name width, where, I didn't split hairs, but they're really probably both in the neighborhood of 47 and a half. 7x8. The tree trunk on the plastic bag version is just a tiny bit smaller, and it's plastic backed. But otherwise, the A3s are virtually identical. And then the A4, you can flip it over quick, and if you see the white paper back, that's the issue. And those are, and the A4, A4.5, and A5 are all no twill. All of the other arrowheads were a twill right, and generally a twill right rough, kind of a heavier twill material. So these are all computer designed. They're all no twill. They all have some kind of backing, either plastic or this paper backing. And so that's basically a summary chart of identifying your 131 arrowhead. And again, these are the ones I know of. Due to their 1 per life restriction, combined with the small size of this one town lodge, these arrowheads represent 10 out of the 10 most difficult Kahagon Lodge 131 issues. So we're 70% through the list, and we can jump to the next one. And this 131 chenille jacket patch was actually the first chenille patch issued by any lodge in all of New England. Now, obviously, chenilles were very popular in Pennsylvania, where Standard Pennant was doing a booming business. But none of the lodges in New England had actually produced a chenille until 1992, when this lodge created jackets for the 16 delegates to the 1992 National OA Conference. So these jackets were 1 per person. And this is a massive, massive chenille. It's roughly 8.5 by 11 in terms of its dimensions. I've got a ruler there just to give it some scale. And 1 per person, 16 guys, super rare. It took me 25 years to finally get one, at least. Yeah, really tough. And I would say this is probably the second most difficult piece in the entire lodge after the A1. And then the only flap to make the list is their S5, which was issued for the Diamond Jubilee 75th anniversary of the BSA in 1985. These were limited to 1 per person and is by far the rarest flap-shaped issue of the lodge. It's interesting that it didn't make Jeff Morley's top flaps list, but that's just because it was issued in 1985 and he cuts off in 1980. But if he were to relax his criteria there, this would be the top flap for this lodge. And then finally, 10 years later, 60th anniversary, 1998, they issued this set of flaps. So the Gold Mylar border was their 60th anniversary flap. And then there was a 60th anniversary segment that you actually got by going to their 60th anniversary celebration fellowship. So technically it's an event, but it doesn't say event. So it's listed as the X1, the first odd shape of the lodge. But the real killer is this version which has staff in the background. And these were issued to the members of the event staff for the 60th anniversary celebration, which were essentially all executive committee members. So this X2, and I've seen the X1S13 set sell on eBay, not that long ago for like $130, $140. I've never seen this staff segment sell. It is super tough. Definitely what I would consider a sleeper because, if you look at just a segment, you don't know that it's OA, you don't know what lodge it is. This may turn up in somebody's dollar box at a traderie someday. But it is super scarce. So trying to summarize things up, if I had to rank these top 10 issues, that first Arrowhead from 1954, I would say is the top issue in the lodge, both from a scarcity standpoint as well as a dollar standpoint, well into four figures there. And then the C1, the chenille, again, limited to a very small group of people, one per person, issued on jackets, most of which are hanging in closets, I'm sure. Again, super rare, again, four figures. And then that X2 staff segment. And I would hesitate to put a dollar value on it, but it is just by nature of, the fact that it went to mostly e-board people working on their anniversary event, again, super scarce. And then the A2. And I had mentioned during the presentation that I thought the A2 was the most common variety of the arrowheads. But because it dates to the 1950s and it's still one per life, I would still rank it fourth. And then at this point, A2, A3, A3, A4, A5, 4.5, A5, that's that's a five-way tie. Because again, they're all tough, small quantities, one per life. I just listed them in order because they're all equally rare. And then finally the S5, and only because I'm sure they made at least 100, if not 200 of that Diamond Jubilee flap. But it is still the rarest flap in the lodge. So, again, something to look for. And then honorable or dishonorable mention, as it turns out, here, their F1 isn't a difficult flap. I think first flaps might rate it as a 2. Being generous, it's actually much easier to acquire now than it was 10, 20 years ago. And there are a few twill varieties. There are a few color shade varieties of the F1, but it's not a difficult first flap. You could go on eBay today and probably find a dozen of them. But the ZS1 is really tough. It's actually the only one I've ever seen. And you might ask yourself, why would someone bother to fake something that's not particularly tough to acquire? But the gentleman that I acquired this fake from, he got it trading at the 1963 National OA Conference. And I suspect they had arrowheads in the 50s. And their lodge history doesn't mention when their first flap was originally issued. But for the sake of argument, let's say it was 1960. And again, super tiny lodge, probably no active traders. So by the 1963 NOAC, people probably had seen it. They probably knew about it. They weren't really out in circulation yet. And so somebody felt the need to go and make a fake and trade them at the NOAC. And the distinguishing factor here is a cut edge. And the kind of cheesy Asian embroidery that you see when things are made overseas in small quantities. But I haven't seen another one. It's pretty rare. I just didn't want to list it as a top 10 issue of the lodge because it was obviously a fake and not issued by the lodge. But it's worth keeping an eye out for. And in most of my presentations, I make a shameless plug for my needs from, the subject that I'm speaking to. But I don't have any needs that I know of from this lodge. I do, if anybody happens to come across a neckerchief, I have A2, A3A, and A3B on neckerchiefs. But I don't have any of the later ones on a neckerchief currently. So I might be interested in picking those up from my collection as variations. And then obviously, if someone discovers a new variety of the arrowhead patch itself, I'd be very interested, both because I'm trying to document all those differences, and it was my lodge for at least a couple of years. So thank you for listening, and be happy to take any questions, Johnny.
So Joe Taylor wrote 131 is mentioned in the WOB book as emblem not available. Your presentation would prove there is no issue from 131 that should be associated with the WOB manual handbook. Agreed?
Agreed. I suspect they had a Caldwell pin.
So I could add a little bit of trivia too about the OA and camp with Kahagon. Norumbega Council, which was out of Newton, Massachusetts, camped with the Cambridge Scouts at Camp Quinnipiac from 1936 to 1946. They were just merged in together. And so when the OA came to Camp Quinnipiac in Kahagon Lodge, scouts from any troop who camped at Quinnipiac could be voted into the OA. They would vote 2 scouts from each troop that camped there into the OA each year. And so there were lots of scouts who were in the OA in Kahagon Lodge who were actually from Norumbega Council. And then in 1947, they started splitting up how the 2 councils camped at Quinnipiac. In July, everybody from Cambridge would camp there, and in August, everybody from Norumbega would camp there. But they were still one OA lodge. And that in 1940, a Norumbega Council member, Warren Young, became the lodge chief of Kahagon Lodge.
Yep.
So we have one camp hosting 2 councils, one lodge with 2 councils, and then 2 lodges starting when Norumbega formed Muscataquid Lodge in 1949. They were still camping at Quinnipiac. So we had Kahagon Lodge at Quinnipiac in July, and we had Norumbega Muscataquid Lodge at Quinnipiac in August. So now we have one camp with 2 separate lodges serving that camp. And that continued all the way until Norumbega Council purchased the property that became Hidden Valley Scout Camp and starting in 1960. And they moved to their own camp and had their own lodge at their own camp at that point. So an interesting little bit of trivia there.
Yep. Yeah, looking at their history, the Kahagon history says there were 23 members called out the first year, and out of those 23 members, 12 were from Norumbega Council. So more than half.
Yeah. So we have a lodge that was, it was a small council, but it also served a second very small council. So we had 2 small councils that were actually served by that lodge. So there's more people in the lodge than might have been presumed solely by the units that were in Cambridge itself.
Yeah, Norumbega had only 3 towns.
That's right.
And I suspect, though, the population of Cambridge outnumbered the...
Oh, I would imagine it well outnumbered the other 3 towns.
So what years would those be where you had 2 councils being in the OA and 1 lodge?
38 to 46?
38 to 46, they camped together. And then from 47 to 1959, both councils used Quinnipiac, but they camped separately at that point. But they were still in the same lodge until 1940, whatever it was, that Muscataquid started. So for like 10 or 11 years, it was one lodge at one camp, but 2 councils. And it looks like, Norumbega formed its own lodge right after, or right around the time that the OA became a national organization in the BSA, 48, so 48, 49. That's the period of time when Norumbega formed its own lodge.